In the last step, we received a 401 when we were trying to execute a post request, even though we had a basic authorization header. How can we fix that? That's what we'll be looking at in this specific step. Let's go over and sign into the application. In 28 minutes, dummy, and say sign in. This would take us inside. The thing which I'm really interested in is logout. So localhost :8080/logout. Once you have logged in, if you go to localhost :8080/logout, in this page, right click and say view page source. Now, there are a few very, very interesting things that you would see in here. Number one is that for logging out, we are making use of a form. So what the logout page is doing is to do a post request to the /logout URL. And because it's doing a post, we would need a CSRF token. Any post or put requests would need a CSRF token. So you can see that Spring is automatically generating a CSRF token and putting it in here. The value of this is here. So you can see that there is a large CSRF token which is being generated and which is being sent. Now what I would want to do is to change this and see what would happen. So I'll close this. I'll do a right click. I'll do a right click inspect. And if you do an inspect, you'll be able to actually change the thing. So I'll actually delete the CSRF token. So we remove the CSRF token, and I'm saying logout. You can see that we are getting an error. It's saying 403 forbidden. If you're using the default configuration of Spring Security, then all post requests or put requests would need a CSRF token. Now let's actually go back. Now let's actually type in the URL again, localhost :8080/logout. And now if you do a right click inspect, you should see the CSRF token in here. And now if I say logout, you'd see that the logout is successfully executed. Now the question is, how can I get the CSRF token in a REST API? One important thing to remember is that if you're building a web application and if you're using things like Timeleaf to build your web application, in that kind of scenario, Spring Security would automatically add a CSRF token for all the forms. However, what if you are using a REST API? How can you create a CSRF token? Let's go ahead and create a simple resource. So I'll copy hello world resource and I'll call this Spring Security Play resource. This is a resource we'll be using to play with Spring Security. And in here, what we would want is to create a CSRF token. And CSRF token. I'd say retrieve CSRF token. And over here, I can get the details from the request. So over here, HTTP servlet request. So the request which is coming in would be wired in here. And from the request, what we would want to do is to get an attribute. What's the name of the attribute? Let's log in 28 minutes. You can see the name of the attribute in here. It's _CSRF. So I would want to get the attribute CSRF. I would want to change the return type. It should not be string. It should be CSRF token. So if you do a control space command space, there's an interface called CSRF token. So this provides the information about an expected CSRF token. So you can get the header name, you can get the parameter name and get the token. There's a compilation error. I'll do a control1 command 1 and add a cast to CSRF token. Request.get attribute returns an object back. We are converting it into a CSRF token and returning it back. Now let's see this in action. So let's see if we'd be able to get a CSRF token. What I'll do is, before I would create a CSRF request, I would save this request. So save as, I'll say save as. The first thing I would do is to create a project. I'll call this Spring Security. Let's add. Let's choose Spring Security and choose, and I'll call this create user post request. I'll say save. So we have the create user post request in here. We can use it whenever we want to. I'll go ahead and create a new draft request. And what we want to do is to send a request. Make sure that you're using HTTP localhost 8080 / this is the URI CSRF token. And to be able to get the CSRF token, you need to add a header. So we'll add an authorization header in 28 minutes. Dummy, and say set. I would go ahead and say enough. Send. So you're getting a token back in the response. I'll save this as well. So this request would be a new one. I'll call this retrieve CSRF token. And I'll save it to Spring Security and save this. Now we have the token written back. You can see that the header name is XCSRF token. So I'll go back to create user post request. And over here, we'll add another header with the name as XCSRF token. So I'm copying this from the retrieve CSRF token. Now, if I have to go back to the CSRF token, I would need to discard the changes, but I would want to actually save them. So I'll say save and continue and go back to retrieve CSRF token, execute it again, and now I would be able to see the token value. So I can go in here and copy the entire token until the end. So make sure that you copy the entire token until the end in there. So what we are doing is we are executing a request to get the CSRF token first, and then when we are making a post request, we are sending the CSRF token to execute the request. In this step, we are talking about cross-site request forgery. We looked at one of the solutions for CSRF, which is to use a CSRF token. A token is generated for each request, and when you make an update request like put post, you need to provide a CSRF token as part of your request headers. One of the important things to remember is that CSRF might not be applicable if there is no session involved. If your REST API is stateless, in those kind of situations, you might not need to worry about CSRF. CSRF is something which is typically tied with your session cookie. And that's why it might not be applicable always. If you're having a pure stateless REST API, you might want to disable CSRF as well. How do you disable CSRF? Let's see that in the next step.